So let's just say your offer for your business on the baseline on a cash-free, debt-free basis would be $10 million with an adequate working capital. If you had an excess $1 million on your balance sheet that you would normally harvest in a cash-free, debt-free deal, that offer in a lockbox deal needs to be 11 million to be the same offer, right? It needs to be account for that excess working capital in the calculation. Hello and welcome to this week's Shoot the Moon podcast. I'm broadcasting live and direct from Revenue Rocket World headquarters. With me today is my partner Ryan Barnett, and a big shout out and thank you to Ashley Patel and our team for warming us up with the Rainbow Connection M&A version. What are we talking about today, Ryan?
Hey, Mike. We have an amazing team at Revenue Rocket, and I wish if you all do morning calls, if they could be as good as our morning calls, in which our own Ashley Patel serenading us with M&A versions of songs that we didn't know quite existed. It's amazing. So thanks, Ash, for yet one more hit. You're going to have a record soon enough. On the show, we are advocates for IT services companies, and we are M&A people focused on IT services companies growing using mergers and acquisitions as a growth mechanism, or a point of if you look to sell your company, a way for an exit, or even to sell into another company. And we talk about things that we ran across and what we work through. And one of the things that we have been working with on since, I think is about April 30th now, based on some of these notes, is the concept of a lockbox in a deal. This is relatively new to me, and I know that we just went through a deal that closed that used some of this, and I just wanted to share with the audience what Lockbox is and learn from it. So, Mike, let's just help me out. Very first question, just what is a lockbox and the mechanism of M&A, and how does it differ from some other strategies around working capital?
Yeah, for sure, Ryan. So there's usually a very specific amount of working capital that's required to go along with a business when it is sold. The easiest way to think about that is for the business to be defined as a going concern. Going concerns have adequate working capital to support their operations moving forward. Very seldom would a business be sold where you just strip assets or you don't sell a going concern. It's almost always all the deals we work on, I would say for the most part, are businesses that sell as a going concern. And when that happens, you have to have adequate working capital. When you have adequate working capital, there's really a couple ways you can approach that in the M&A world. You can do it via what we call cash-free, debt-free transaction, which sets a working capital peg or a working capital amount of positive net working capital that's required to be left in the business to transact a deal. And in that situation, there may be additional working capital or positive net working capital that's in the business that the seller could harvest. So to give you a classic example, let's say you, just for simple numbers, you would set your peg, your working capital peg, at a positive net working capital of $100,000, and that would mean you would have $100,000 more in assets and liabilities on your balance sheet. And let's say you had another $500,000 in cash sitting in the balance in the business just to be available in case you would need it. Well, at the time of a transaction, in that scenario, if $100,000 was determined to be the appropriate amount of positive net working capital, then you could harvest the $500,000. You could take that out of the business and spend it as if you wish. Generally, that is value that goes to the owner. Now, when you do that, you generally have to have what we call a working capital true-up post-close, because there's times when there might be unexpected liabilities that hit the business or things that occur post-close that may require that the seller participate in that. And generally, there's a holdback to accommodate that gets paid to the seller. So there's some adjustments that go post-transaction. And some people don't like surprises after the sale is closed, and they don't want to be exposed to potential risk associated with things that may have occurred on their watch prior to close and then have to pay for those post-close. So in that scenario, there's another approach called using a lockbox. This is a pretty dominant approach. It's used in Europe. in M&A transactions, and it's the ability to actually set a fixed purchase price inclusive of the balance sheet, so that you know that at close, that's the number you're going to get and that there will be no post-closing adjustments. Now, it comes with some work you have to do ahead of time, like you have to set a threshold for what is appropriate indebtedness, what is leakage of expenses or things that would show up on the liability side. And then you have to very carefully value the excess working capital on the balance sheet and making sure if you're a seller that you're getting credit for that, because that also goes along in the lockbox. You don't harvest that excess working capital like you do in a cash-free, debt-free deal. Does that help set the stage here, Ryan?
Yeah, I think it does. There's a lot of concepts that are going on here, Mike. So the going concern, the company is going to continue with that. You have to have adequate amount of working capital to help keep that business afloat. And what we've seen in transactions, working capital is always a battle. Mike, is that right? Like if you could just take a simple step back, there's always some kind of back and forth. This becomes something that's calculated nearly the last day of the trade of the process, pulling balance sheets the day of. So the challenges with working capital, I think, are apparent in every deal. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, for sure. Because, typically in a cash-free, debt-free deal, you're going to look at what the average working capital requirement was for the business. That may not be the same as what the average working capital total number was, because it may include excess working capital. Usually entrepreneurs have excess working capital in their business kind of for a rainy day. Maybe they have a much higher coverage ratio than they normally would need to run the business. So, you start at what was the yearly average, and then you look at what is actually required to fund and operate the business. Those are usually two different numbers, and it represents the excess working capital number that a seller is able to harvest.
Right.
So I just want to make that really clear. There's always a number, and it's always somewhat negotiable, because you want to, a buyer wants to, of course, get as much working capital as they can. The seller wants as little working capital as they can get to. But I would tell you that the principles around how to negotiate that are well established. Generally, in a cash-free, debt-free deal, I would say those principles are also well established in a lockbox deal. It's just a sort of a different mechanism, and you have to be able to account for that excess cash, or that in a growing business, to be kind of frank, as a seller, that the benefit of that growing business from the time you set the lockbox date until you close actually flows to the buyer versus the seller. So in a cash-free, debt-free deal, that benefit would flow to the seller. And so that's a very important point to make, that, who benefits in a growing business between the time of when you would set a lockbox date and close, or if you were to use a cash-free, debt-free mechanism.
Sure. So Mike, that goes to exactly my question, and you touched on a tiny bit, but how does the lockbox date get chosen, and what happens if deals drag past that lockbox date? Does that strengthen the buyer's hand, or is that just really frustrating the seller?
Well, a lockbox date usually gets set once there's been enough due diligence to understand, what the assets and liabilities in the business are, and an offer is made and a letter of intent is signed. So, if an offer is made and you agree upon the number, that's sort of the all-in number in a lockbox deal, inclusive of whatever's on the balance sheet from a positive net working capital perspective. In a cash-free, debt-free deal, that's not the case. The offer price does not include excess working capital. That excess working capital is in addition to the purchase price in a cash-free, debt-free deal for the seller. So that's an important point. And the challenge really is, you'll want to close, if you're using a lockbox mechanism and you're a seller, you're going to want to close as quickly as possible after you set that lockbox date. This is usually about the time you sign an LOI, and you need to be quick about close. You have to be efficient about close, because understand that the benefits of additional growth in the business or additional accumulation of cash in the business will go to the buyer in a lockbox deal. And, if it drags 3, 4, or 5 months, then, there's more and more benefit going to the buyer, which if you're the seller, it's very, very frustrating. In a cash-free, debt-free deal, that benefit would come to the seller. But, the knife does cut both ways, both in the lockbox and in the cash-free, debt-free deal. Because if the business goes down and is consuming cash, obviously those either losses or reduction in working capital is covered by the seller. But it's also impacts the seller in a lockbox deal, because it's considered what would be considered leakage or would be considered indebtedness. And because the offer price in the lockbox deal back at the LOI was made inclusive of the balance sheet as it existed at that time, any degradation in that balance sheet will be reflected in a reduction in purchase price accordingly in a lockbox deal.
Right, right. So, Mike, let's dig into that a little bit. It seems like can be very heated debates about what counts as leakage and how escrows tie into that. And so those leakage seem to trigger some of the biggest fights. And so I guess what's the difference between kind of normal leakage and permitted leakage? And how do you prevent that from being a deal killer? So leakage examples would be really helpful. And then just understanding how do we deal with that normal leakage versus quote unquote permitted leakage?
Yeah, so normal permitted leakage typically will be things that are defined in a schedule. So oftentimes those can be trade payables as an example. Trade payables go up and down. It's a fluid situation. It's usually within a certain amount is considered okay. As you think about this in the eyes and minds of a buyer, they're going to say, well, pick a number, there's 250 grand of trade payables at any given time or less. So as long as that defined leakage, permitted leakage is less than 250 grand, we'll consider it to be okay. Could be 100 grand, could be 200 grand, but whatever, as long as the trade payables are current and they're in that sort of band, then life is good. That's been figured out in their calculation around purchase price. It's accommodated accordingly. Now, if it goes over that amount, then it's got to be addressed by the seller, right? By reduction in purchase price. There's certain things though that aren't permitted. So, for example, if a owner was to during the lockbox period strip a bunch of cash out of the business, which they technically would legally be able to do, because if they had what would be considered excess working capital in a cash-free, debt-free situation, take that cash out, it would just be less for them to harvest at close in a cash-free, debt-free deal. In a lockbox deal, though, the price was determined inclusive of that excess cash. So if they strip that, that's a non-permitted leakage draw, and they would have to accommodate for it in purchase price, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does make sense. It's again, complicated concept here, but I can see how that can make sense. Mike, in some of the deals that we were looking at, they had, in the case, they had prepaid some taxes and some significant net operating losses, and they didn't necessarily see a justification for tax indemnity escrows. And why would buyers want to push so hard on tax indemnities in lockbox deals, even when the sellers kind of think they're fully paid up? Is this something where is it really a risk management strategy here, or is this a negotiation strategy? And I'll tell you that the same kind of thing. If someone is doing things like increasing escrow demands, or maybe withholding a consulting agreement to drag out the deal, or just dragging out negotiations in general, if you have this lockbox date sent and the buyer is doing things to continue to spread things out, it seems like a dangerous thing for the seller here. So how do you tell a difference between that buyer managing risk in good faith versus almost playing games in the transaction to wear a seller down?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Ryan. First let's tackle the tax indemnity question. The reason the buyer would want to have tax indemnities or escrows for that is because technically in the lockbox scenario, they're assuming those liabilities. And if it's not called out specifically, that could be leakage that was unforeseen that they would be responsible for, right? Especially if they're doing a stock deal, right? They're doing a deal, they're buying all the stock of the corporation. If there was, let's say, unpaid taxes, or there's an audit that comes post-transaction, it's a lockbox deal. The principle of the lockbox is they're going to get paid with no adjustments post-closing, and they take that risk associated with the transaction. And so it's always a heated debate because, how much are you willing to sign up for an indemnity for tax when the principle of the lockbox approach is that the buyer's taking on that risk, right? It's about risk. So they're going to try to mitigate that risk by having an indemnity, make sure they have a big enough escrow holdback, make sure if they have any issue or question that they're going to try to, mitigate it with that basket. Now, as it relates to timeliness, certainly, there is a lot of things to negotiate in a transaction. I think most of our listeners understand that. And that takes time, right? A lot of time people need to think about particular compromises, come up with creative ideas. You've got a lot of cooks in the kitchen with lawyers and M&A advisors and principals of the respective companies. And, everyone's trying to come up with a creative solution that can be win-win and meet people's objectives. And we can't deal with all of the objections overnight. I mean, it'd be great if we could, but we can't because there's usually hundreds of them in a typical purchase agreement. Now, bad actors certainly could drag out negotiations to benefit the buyer in a growing business in a lockbox situation, because the longer they go and the more growth there is in the period between the lockbox date and close, the more benefit the buyer gets. And so there's certainly a siren call, if you will, probably to not move too darn quickly in a growing and going concern in a lockbox scenario, because that benefit that occurs in that stub period between the lockbox dates and close will flow to the buyer. And so the opposite side of that certainly is the business could be flat or down slightly, and as long as it's within the permitted leakage amount, that could incrementally benefit the seller as well, particularly if the leakage basket was large enough. So I don't want to make it sound like it just could benefit only the buyer. It tends to benefit the buyer more than the seller, particularly in a growing business. But in a shrinking business, it could certainly benefit the seller as well.
Seems like it's one of those mechanisms where there's a push for price certainty, and the lockbox should help with the price certainty. So you have less messy post-close adjustments, and there's just you're setting a date and an amount that you're targeting towards, so it theoretically should reduce surprises. I think in this process, Mike, it seemed interesting that it seemed to introduce more surprises, or it made the deal become, in some levels, unfair as time got interjected into it. And perhaps that's my just understanding of this. I was not working that particular transaction, so there does seem some interest on why people would use it. Mike, you mentioned this is more common in Europe. Do you have a reason why? I know that sellers have often had more leverage to dictate terms in Europe. Accounting standards are more standardized a bit. But ultimately, it seems like European buyers, they really like simplicity. So number one's kind of avoid disputes later. Where compared to U.S. deals, where there's oftentimes a working capital true-up, and kind of a litigious culture in the United States pushes more adjustments instead of that upfront clarity. I'm curious, just have you seen why Europe uses this more than the United States?
Well, I think partially because of two things you brought up. One is purchase price certainty, right? Very important to a seller. You want to know that if you're going to sell your business, you're going to get it for X million dollars, and inclusive of the balance sheet because it's an understood number, it's transparent. And if you're going to harvest some of that balance sheet, I think maybe Europeans tend to not keep as much excess working capital on their balance sheets as we do here in the States. I don't know, but I think in a situation that was much more normative working capital, you can certainly have more certainty. I think the other thing that probably drives it more often than not, however, is that European companies tend to close deals faster. 60 days from LOI to close is not atypical in a European country in a private to private transaction. The purchase agreements tend to be a little more common sense, not quite as voluminous or open for interpretation, and as a result, they don't have as much negotiating hair on them, if you will. They don't need as much negotiating prowess to get done. They're just as fewer potential, just less room for interpretation and less room for error there than there is here. So in a situation where purchase price certainty is a requirement and there's not a lot of excess working capital, and you can close deals within 60 days where it's real and practical to do so, a lockbox can work pretty well. I think when you add in all the nuance of what happens in the States, where deals can get drawn out, most of the time it takes 90 days from LOI to close, could take longer. We have a lot more uncertainty, tend to have a higher coverage ratio on balance sheets of excess working capital and actually is what is required. All those things sort of add up to making using a lockbox in the state more difficult.
Sure, that makes sense. And Mike, if you see, it sounds like the lockbox is an LOI. Is that typically correct, or is that going to see something in definitive agreements?
It will be pointed out as the mechanism for reconciling working capital in the LOI. The actual details of what's in leakage and in the lockbox, et cetera, gets worked out in the definitive agreement.
Okay, yeah. Interesting. So I guess this is my really last question for you. Thanks for exploring this here today. This is a topic that it seems nuanced, but if I was to title this podcast something, it's deal mechanisms you've never heard of, but you might deal with. And this lockbox is something that the reason I asked that LOI question, it can come across as simply one word. Hey, this will be based on a lockbox calculation and a set date. And if you're reading through that, you may actually pass over that. When you get an LOI, you're more excited about the deal terms. And we have to remember this is a big part of the deal terms, even though it's not calculated in quote unquote the enterprise value. And so I think that's something to be careful about. So Mike, the next time you see lockbox in an LOI and we're representing a company for sale, how are you going to treat that differently?
I think what's important to note is you have to understand that the offer has to include a calculation for the excess working capital. So let's just say your offer for your business, the baseline on a cash-free, debt-free basis would be $10 million with an adequate working capital. If you had an excess $1 million on your balance sheet that you would normally harvest in a cash-free, debt-free deal, that offer in a lockbox deal needs to be 11 million to be the same offer, right? It needs to be account for that excess working capital in the calculation. And so you need to make sure you're comparing, apples to apples and not apples to oranges. And you have to have a very high certainty to close quickly after the LOI. So you have to have comfort with the buyer that they're able to move quickly. Ideally, within 60 days, certainly no longer than 90 days. And in a growing business, assuming your business is up and to the right and growing, like we advise all clients who are, looking to command a premium in the sale of their business, it is a bit of a seller's beware situation. Because remember that in this scenario, even if you accommodated for that excess working capital, that the additional gains that would come to that business, let's say in the 30 or the 90 or 120 days it might take to close, are going to flow to the buyer versus you as a seller. So all those things you have to keep in mind. Certainly the things that we'll keep in mind as we represent companies for sale and bring them to market.
That makes sense. Now, Mike, thank you so much for going through this topic. Really excited for our listeners here to learn a little nuance in deal making. So I'll turn it for you for any closing thoughts.
Sounds great, Grant. I appreciate it. So with that, we'll tie a ribbon on it for this week's Shoot the Moon podcast. Encourage you to tune in next time when we unpack other topics for M&A in the IT services world. Thanks for tuning in and look forward to having you take a listen next time.